The lead SUV was still burning when he moved, not running, not reacting. Moving with the particular economy of a man who had already calculated every angle before the explosion finished happening. The canyon walls threw the smoke back down. The road was sealed in both directions. 4 vehicles, no signal, no exit, and somewhere on that ridgeline, men with weapons who had known exactly where to be. Nobody in that convoy knew his name. That was the thing. The security team scattered. The radios screamed static. Glass fractured across every window in white, reaching lines. And the man they had spent all morning ignoring, the contract driver, the replacement, the one Harold Reed had publicly dismissed in the executive garage, before sunrise was already reading the direction of incoming fire through the cracks in the windshield. He had done this before. The question nobody thought to ask was where, and why, after everything that had stripped that life away from him. He had shown up this morning anyway. He moved the car. The morning Anthony Wilson drove Maren Whitfield to her death, or close enough to it that the difference barely mattered, started the same way every morning started at Carter Dynamics. Badly. Not dramatically badly. Not the kind of badly that announces itself. The kind of badly that hides inside normal things. Inside, a schedule printed on company letterhead. Inside a route change buried in a 5:47 a.m. email that most people wouldn't read until they were already in the car. Anthony read it at 4:31. He'd been awake since 4:30. Same as always. Same as the 12 years before this one, and the 8 years before those. His body had decided, somewhere around 1997, that sleep past 4:30 was a luxury it couldn't afford, and it had never changed its mind since. He made coffee. He read the email. He set the mug down on the counter without drinking from it, and he stood in the kitchen of his Aurora apartment with a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Redstone Pass. He knew Redstone Pass, not because he'd driven it before he hadn't, but because he'd studied it the night before. The same way he studied every route before every assignment, the same habit drilled into him over 2 decades of work that the agency would later pretend he'd never done correctly. He had the topographic map open on his laptop until past 1 a.m. He knew where the canyon narrowed. He knew where the road curved without warning and the rock walls closed in from both sides like hands coming together. He knew there was one entrance and one exit, and nothing in between but 2 miles of terrain that offered no good options if something went wrong. The original route didn't go near it. The original route ran north along I-70, clean highway, multiple exit points, elevation gain gradual enough that a limousine handled it without drama. Somebody had changed it overnight. Somebody had written a 4-line email with no explanation attached, listed a new route through terrain that a trained protective driver would flag immediately, and sent it at 5:47 in the morning, knowing full well that most people on the convoy team wouldn't see it until they were already assembling in the garage. Anthony saw it. He closed the laptop, finished getting dressed, drove his 2009 Accord to the Carter Dynamics Tower in downtown Denver, and pulled into the executive garage at 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of his scheduled arrival, because being on time in this business was the same thing as being late. The limousine was already there. Black, armored, long enough to feel like a statement. He walked the length of it before he unlocked it, a habit the agency had built into him, so deeply it had become involuntary, the way breathing was involuntary, starting at the rear panel and working forward, crouching to check the undercarriage, rising to check the tires, pausing at the communication equipment mounted in the interior panel, behind the driver's seat. That's where he found the first thing. A scratch. Not on the outside of the housing, on the edge of the internal panel where the mounting screws sat. A thin, bright line in the matte black finish, the kind of mark left when a screwdriver slips. The paint around it hadn't oxidized, hadn't dulled. It was fresh, hours old at most, which meant sometime between when the vehicle was secured the night before and when Anthony arrived at 5:58 a.m., somebody had opened this panel. He took out his phone, photographed it, didn't mention it to anyone. He had no proof of anything yet, and in 12 years of hard education, he had learned that an accusation without evidence wasn't protection, it was noise, and noise got you dismissed before you could do any good. He was still crouching by the rear wheel well when Harold Reed came around the corner of the garage with 3 members of the security team behind him. Harold Reed was the kind of man who carried his authority like a second body. Wide through the shoulders, 6'2" in flat shoes, with a face that had settled somewhere between severity and contempt and seemed comfortable staying there. He'd been head of corporate security at Carter Dynamics for 4 years. He knew the building, the staff, the schedules, the habits. He knew which board members arrived early and which ones required 3 reminders. He knew which routes Vanessa Carter preferred and which hotels she refused to stay at, and which members of her executive team were late every Monday without fail. He looked at Anthony for a long moment before he spoke. Looked at the Accord parked in the visitor spot. Looked at Anthony's jacket, which was clean but not expensive, well fitted but not tailored. The jacket of a man who bought what lasted, not what impressed. We're transporting a billion-dollar executive through dangerous terrain. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had decided the conversation was already over, not driving a passenger to catch a flight. Anthony straightened up from the wheel well. He didn't answer. He walked to the front of the limousine and crouched again to check the other front tire, which was honestly not the response Harold Reed was accustomed to receiving. Something shifted in Harold's expression. Not anger. Something quieter than anger and colder. He watched Anthony finish the check, watched him stand and move to inspect the wind foam seals on the driver's side, and then he turned and walked back toward his own vehicle without another word. But Anthony had already catalogued the third thing before Harold was 10 steps away. The backup vehicle. Standard protective convoy protocol that Anthony had drilled into his bodies so many times over so many years that it felt less like knowledge and more like gravity placed the secondary vehicle in the number 2 position, directly behind the principal's car, close enough to intervene, close enough to matter. The vehicle that was currently idling at the far end of the garage, furthest from the limousine, was Harold Reed's arrangement. His positioning, his decision, which put the medical equipment and additional staff as far from Vanessa Carter as you could get, while still technically being in the same convoy. Anthony noted it. He walked to Harold's position and asked, directly and without preamble, 3 questions. Why had the route changed last minute? Why had the backup vehicle been placed at the rear of the formation? And who had approved both decisions? Harold's response was to look at him the way certain people look at a question they've decided isn't worth answering, and then to say, with the kind of precision that is designed to close a door, hold the wheel and stay quiet. Anthony held the wheel, but he didn't stay quiet inside his own head, and the thing running through that head, quiet and relentless as water finding its way through stone, was the shape of a morning 12 years ago in Arizona that had begun with almost exactly the same arrangements. Vanessa Carter came down from the 42nd floor at 6:47 a.m. She came the way she came everywhere, ahead of her assistant, slightly ahead of her security detail, moving with the brisk deliberateness of a woman who had learned early that if you didn't set the pace, you'd spend your entire career keeping up with someone else's. She was 48 years old and carried it in a way that suggested she had no particular interest in the subject. Her natural hair was trimmed close, precise. The way everything about her was precise. She wore a white business suit that, in the executive garage's harsh overhead lighting, practically generated its own illumination. She had her phone to her ear before she reached the limousine. Anthony already had the rear door open. She passed him without looking at him, not dismissively, or not only dismissively, but with the focused inattention of someone managing for simultaneous priorities and allocating her visual attention accordingly. He registered as door-opening function, not as person. He closed the door, walked to the driver's side, sat down and adjusted the mirror by a single degree. Not because it needed adjusting, but because repositioning the mirror gave him a full view of the rear passenger compartment, which was where Vanessa Carter currently sat. And watching the rear compartment without appearing to watch it was a habit he'd developed over years of work that nobody in this garage knew he'd done. Through the mirror, he could see her speaking to whoever was on the other end of the call. Her expression was focused, controlled, but around the edges of it, in the set of her jaw, in the way she held the phone slightly too tight, there was something that looked less like confidence and more like someone maintaining confidence through force of will. He filed it away. The convoy assembled. Harold's security SUV second in line, the limousine third, the support vehicle with the medical equipment at the rear. Wrong formation. Already wrong. Anthony looked at the configuration in the rearview mirror and calculated exactly how long it would take the support vehicle to reach the limousine if something happened in the middle of the convoy, and the answer made his jaw tighten. He kept his face still. They pulled out of the garage at 7:02 a.m. The gray pickup appeared at the second intersection after they cleared the downtown grid. Anthony noticed it the way he noticed everything, not with alarm, but with the particular quality of attention that registers information and catalogs it without showing on the outside. The truck was positioned 2 vehicles back, not directly behind. A careful distance, the kind of distance maintained by someone who knew what a tail looked like and was trying not to look like one. He changed lanes on a 4-lane stretch of Federal Boulevard, not aggressively, just enough merging right at a point where there was no particular reason to merge, no obstruction ahead, no upcoming turn. The gray pickup moved right. He changed back left 60 seconds later, at another point with no particular logic behind it. The gray pickup moved left. In the rear compartment, Vanessa Carter ended one call and immediately began another. She glanced up once and caught Anthony's eyes in the mirror. "You're drifting," she said. "You realize you're drifting. Checking something. What you're checking is making us run behind schedule. Keep the line." He didn't argue, didn't explain, kept the line as requested, while continuing to track the gray pickup in his peripheral vision for the next 4 miles. It stayed with them. As the convoy climbed toward the mountains, as the Denver skyline fell away behind them, and the terrain changed from urban grid to highway to the beginning of the high country, Anthony reached over and switched the radio from the assigned convoy frequency to the secondary backup channel. Static. Not the intermittent static of a weak signal, the flat, consistent static of a channel that had been deliberately silenced. He switched back to the primary channel, heard the clipped exchanges between the convoy vehicles, switched to secondary again. Nothing. He switched back to primary, thought about it for a moment, then radioed Harold. "Secondary communication channel is down." Harold's voice came back immediately. "We're entering mountain terrain. Signal drops in this area. The secondary channel runs on satellite relay. It doesn't depend on local signal strength." A pause. The kind of pause that wasn't processing, it was deciding. "Wilson, I know what the channel runs on." "Focus on the road." Anthony focused on the road. He reached down and quietly switched to an offline topographic map he'd loaded to the vehicle system the night before, a redundancy he'd built in after realizing the primary GPS was mapping through a server, which meant it was as jammable as every other system in the convoy that happened to be relying on digital infrastructure someone else controlled. None of the other drivers in the convoy had offline maps. He knew this because he'd asked when the convoy was assembling in the garage. He'd framed it as a casual question, the kind of question that looked like professional conversation rather than preparation. 3 drivers, 0 offline maps. All 3 trusting their vehicles' factory navigation systems, which were currently all routing through the same server, which was currently showing 3 separate vehicles following the route that Harold had approved. The route that hadn't existed until 5:47 this morning. Vanessa Carter noticed him watching the mirror again somewhere in the second hour of the drive. "What is it?" she said. Not a question exactly, the tone of someone who had been monitoring something and had decided the monitoring warranted address. We're being followed. He said it the way you say a fact. No drama attached. Gray pickup, 2 vehicles back. Has been with us since Federal and Colfax. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her in the mirror processing this, not panicking. Harold knows? I radioed it, he said to continue. Another quiet moment. Then, what else are you seeing? This was a different question than the ones she'd asked before. This wasn't correction. This was inquiry. The backup vehicle is in the wrong position. Secondary communication is down, and the reason given doesn't hold technically. The route change this morning was logged at 5:47 a.m. with no explanation attached, and someone opened the communication housing in this vehicle at some point overnight. He paused. The scratch on the mounting screws was made with a flathead driver. The paint hasn't had time to oxidize. The silence in the rear compartment changed texture. You checked the communication housing. Before we left the garage, you photographed it. He didn't answer that one, didn't need to. She leaned back slightly, not relaxing, but recalibrating. The phone was still in her hand, but she'd stopped pretending she was about to use it. You're a contract driver. Yes. Who checks communication housings before departures? Yes. The silence again, and then, quieter, almost to herself. Who are you? He didn't answer that one either. But the question sat in the vehicle with them. For the next 40 minutes, like a third passenger, the construction warning sign appeared at the mouth of the canyon road. Anthony saw it from 300 yards out. Orange diamond, road work ahead, new post, bright paint. The kind of sign that the county transportation department deployed with certain equipment and certain procedures that left specific marks on the landscape. The post was clean, no equipment tracks in the dirt around it. No survey flags staked out along the shoulder. No gradual progression of warning signs, the ones that usually started half a mile back before building to the work zone. And the earth at the base of the post was dry. It had rained 2 nights ago. The shoulders along this stretch of road were still damp. The rock faces above the canyon held the dark waterlogging of recent rain. But the dirt at the base of this signpost was dry and undisturbed, as though the sign had been placed after the rain had already dried, which meant it had been placed this morning, or possibly yesterday afternoon at the earliest. Which meant it was not a county construction sign. He radioed Harold, kept his voice even, steady, requesting we reverse the convoy and take an alternate route. The sign at the canyon entrance is not a legitimate county installation. Harold's voice came back with the particular sharpness of a man who has decided that other people's observations are a personal inconvenience. The main route has a debris slide. This is the designated alternate. Keep moving, Wilson. I'd like confirmation from the county transportation office before we proceed. We don't have signal for outside calls. We have satellite relay on the primary frequency, which is for convoy communication, not for you to run independent verification checks. You are a driver. Drive. Anthony looked at the sign again as they passed it. He looked at the post, at the dry dirt, at the absence of any of the contextual markers that legitimate temporary signage always carried. Then he looked up at the ridgeline above the canyon entrance and saw the light. It was brief, a single flash, like sun-catching glass, up in the rocks maybe 200 feet above the road. Gone immediately. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, and the kind of thing you'd dismiss as a trick of light if you didn't already have 12 other data points suggesting someone up in those rocks had a very specific reason to be watching an armored limousine enter a narrow canyon with one entrance and one exit. His hands stayed steady on the wheel. His face stayed neutral. But something in his chest, the part that had spent 8 years training to see these moments coming, and 12 years trying to forget they existed, went completely still. He checked the convoy formation in his mirror one more time. Then he reached down and activated the topographic overlay on his offline map. The canyon closed around them. That's the word for it. Closed. The road narrowed. The rock walls rose on either side, and the light changed the way it changes when you enter a place where the sky becomes a strip instead of an expanse. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in the space of a quarter mile. The sounds changed, less wind, more echo. Every vehicle noise reflected back off the stone. Anthony had driven in places like this before. Specifically, he had trained in places like this: closed terrain, restricted maneuver space, environments where the tactical problem wasn't the enemy in front of you, but the geometry of where you could and couldn't move. And the thing about this particular canyon that he'd noted at 1 a.m. when he was studying the topographic map was that the road had one good stretch for a vehicle trap, a slight left curve at the 1.1 mile mark, where the outside of the curve pressed close to the canyon wall, and the sight lines shortened just enough that you couldn't see what was waiting around the bend until you were already in the worst possible position to respond to it. He'd noted it. He'd made a mental note to flag it during the pre-convoy briefing. He hadn't gotten a chance to flag it because Harold Reed had told him to hold the wheel and stay quiet. He radioed Harold again, 3/4 of a mile into the canyon. "Recommend we reverse the limousine's position in the formation. Move it to the rear of the convoy." Harold's response came back at a volume that suggested this suggestion had specifically damaged something in his day. You are seriously, right now, suggesting we reorganize a $300 million security operation based on standard protective protocol positions the principal vehicle furthest from the point of first contact. I designed this convoy's protocol. Then you know that. The pause was longer this time. When Harold spoke again, the volume was controlled, but the temperature had dropped to something approaching absolute zero. "Wilson, I have run security operations for executives on 4 continents. I know every formation, every protocol, every contingency. You are sitting behind a steering wheel because someone called in sick this morning, and your entire job description is to keep that limousine between the lines. Am I clear?" Anthony was quiet for a moment, then clear. He switched to his offline map, checked the 1.1 mile mark, 3/10 of a mile ahead. In the rear compartment, Vanessa had put the phone away. She was watching him. "You radioed about the formation?" "Yes." Harold said no. "Yes." A pause. Then something shifting in her voice, not softness. "Exactly. But a crack in the professional surface, through which something more direct was coming. Should I be concerned?" He looked at her, in the mirror. The honest answer was yes. The useful answer was something more specific than yes. "We're going into a location with restricted maneuver space, compromised communications, and a route that changed without explanation this morning. Those 3 things together are they're unusual. Unusual. The word I'm choosing." She's looked out the window at the canyon walls. Something moved behind her eyes, calculation, and something beneath it. A weight that wasn't there in the car an hour ago. "I have a demonstration today that determines whether this company survives the next board meeting. I need to be at that facility." "I know. So what are you telling me?" He watched the road ahead. "I'm telling you what I see. What you do with it is your decision." And then Vanessa Carter did something he hadn't expected. She sat back, set the phone on the seat beside her, where it sat untouched, and started watching the same ridgeline he was watching. She noticed the scar, or she'd noticed it before, and was just now asking about it, the thin ridge of old scar tissue that ran from the back of his left ear down the curve of his neck, the kind of mark left by something that had happened fast and close. She asked, quietly, if he'd served in the military. "I drove for the federal government." She looked at him in the mirror for a moment. The phrasing was specific, and she was precise enough to notice that it was specific. "Which part of the federal government?" He kept his eyes on the road, 1 mile into the canyon, 1/10 to the left curve. And what he didn't say, what he had not said to anyone in the 12 years since he walked out of a federal building in Washington, carrying a cardboard box with his personal effects and not looking back, because looking back was what you did when you thought there was a possibility things might be different. And Anthony Wilson had made his peace with the certainty that they were not. What he didn't say was that he had spent 8 years as a member of the counter-assault team of the United States Secret Service. Not motor pool, not administrative transport, the team that trained for a single purpose: to extract the protected individual from a coordinated violent attack and get them out alive no matter what the attack looked like or how many people were conducting it. He had stood within arm's reach of a president of the United States on 11 separate occasions. He had operated in 3 countries. He stopped that thought. Not abroad. Keep the memory domestic. He had operated in environments that made this canyon look like a parking lot, and he had been assigned 12 years ago to a protective convoy in Arizona that had received a route change at the last minute, discovered its backup communication channel was down and entered a section of terrain with restricted maneuver space and no clear exit options. Terry Coleman had been in the vehicle behind him, his closest partner, 8 years of work together. Work that built the particular kind of trust that has nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with the knowledge that the person beside you will make the right decision in the worst possible second. Terry had 2 kids, had past tense, because Terry had died on a concrete median in Arizona with a bullet in him that should not have been there, because the route they took should not have been the route they took, because someone who knew exactly how to arrange an ambush had arranged one. And Terry's last coherent words, spoken into Anthony's ear while Anthony was applying pressure to a wound he already knew was not survivable, were, "Somebody on our side, let them in, Tony. It was us." The investigation that followed had concluded that Agent Anthony Wilson had altered the convoy formation without authorization, creating the tactical gap that allowed the attack to succeed, that the attack itself had been anticipated and reported by Wilson prior to entering the zone, was noted in the. It didn't change the conclusion. Someone had needed to be responsible for Terry Coleman's death, and Anthony Wilson was convenient, and the file had been sealed before anyone could ask too many questions about who had changed the route. Anthony had not fought the fight. He had a daughter, Brenda was 12 at the time, and a wife who was already sick, though they didn't know how sick yet, and fighting a sealed federal investigation required exactly the kind of sustained, expensive, well-connected effort that a man whose career had just been ended did not have access to. He had walked away, worked jobs that didn't ask much about his history, sold the house when the medical bills got serious, raised Brenda alone after Patricia died, raised her well, watched her graduate college, and move into her own apartment in Denver and start the careful, real work of building her life. Had Sunday dinners with her. Didn't talk about Arizona. Didn't talk about any of it, because in 12 years nobody had asked, and now he was 1/10 of a mile from a left curve in a canyon that he already knew was wrong. In a vehicle with a woman he'd never met before this morning, watching a ridgeline for the flash of light that would tell him whether his worst assessment of this situation was correct. 3 crows lifted off a cluster of trees on the ridge, all at once. Not wind. They went straight up the way birds go up when something large and deliberate moves through their vicinity. The way they went up in Arizona when the team on the ridge above the highway started moving into position. Anthony's hands tightened on the wheel. 1 degree of tension, no more. Behind him, Vanessa Carter had gone very still. The lead SUV rounded the left curve and kept going. "Get down," Anthony said. Vanessa started to speak. "Get on the floor now." And she heard something in it, not volume, not fear, but the quality of absolute certainty in a voice that has been here before, and she went. The maintenance truck appeared first. It came from behind, emerging from a turnout Anthony hadn't seen marked on any map, which meant it had been backed in there prior to the convoy's arrival, and had been waiting. It pulled out slowly, not aggressively, just enough to fill the road behind the support vehicle and make the option of reversing complicated. Then the logging truck came from around the left curve at the 1.1 mile mark, already sideways, already stopped. Not a vehicle that had broken down, not a driver who'd lost control. It was positioned with the precision of something that had been driven into that location by someone who knew exactly how much space they needed to block and how to block it. The canyon in front of the convoy was no longer a road. It was a room with no door. Anthony had his radio in hand. Brake formation. All vehicles brake formation now. Harold's voice started to respond. The lead SUV exploded. Not catastrophically, not the kind of explosion that dismantles things down to components. The kind that flips a vehicle and sets it burning in a way that has no more narrative left in it. One moment the lead SUV was there, at the front of the formation, and the next it was sideways against the canyon wall, with fire coming from underneath it, and black smoke beginning to climb the rock face above. The shockwave hit the limousine hard enough to throw Vanessa Carter into the rear footwell, despite the fact that she was already on the floor. Hard enough to crack the windshield across its full width, in a pattern of white fractures that left Anthony looking at the road through something that resembled a spider's web made of broken safety glass. He had already moved. Before the shockwave fully arrived, before the sound caught up to the concussion, his hands were doing the sequence that had been trained into them. So deeply, it existed below conscious thought. Gear into reverse, wheel hard right to bring. The rear of the vehicle around, engine to 3/4 power rather than full power on a confined road with a limousine's wheelbase and a slick surface was how you ended up unable to maneuver. And Anthony Wilson had never in his life chosen speed over control. Vanessa, his voice was level, even. The voice of someone narrating instead of experiencing. Stay on the floor. Hands over your head. A sound from the rear compartment that was not quite words. She was doing it. The canyon walls closed in as he brought the limousine around, using Harold's security SUV which had stopped, doors already opening, men pouring out as a physical barrier between the limousine's passenger side and the ridge above them. He cut the vehicle's electrical systems using the manual override, because he knew the limousine's onboard security suite was remotely accessible, and he did not know who had access to it. He released the mechanical door backup to prevent any remote lock from trapping them, and he read the incoming fire through the cracked windshield, the angle of impact marks, the direction the glass had fractured, the sound arriving from slightly left of center, relative to their current heading. 2 positions, possibly 3, all elevated, which told him something crucial. Elevated shooters taking position before the convoy entered the canyon. An explosion positioned to disable the lead vehicle rather than destroy it. Maintenance truck and logging truck blocking both exits. Communication systems already down. The shots that were currently striking the limousine's armored exterior were hitting the body panels, the hood, the rear quarter panels. Not the windows. Not directly at the passenger compartment. They were trying to drive the passengers out of the vehicle, not kill them inside it. Which meant Vanessa Carter was worth more alive than dead. Which meant this was a capture operation, not an assassination. Which meant he had something to work with. Harold Reed was on the radio screaming something about taking the high ground. Anthony watched through the cracked windshield as 2 of Harold's security team started up the slope toward the ridge and made it approximately 40 feet before incoming fire forced them back to the canyon floor in a scramble that had nothing professional about it. He had known that would happen. He had known it the moment Harold gave the order, because moving up an exposed slope toward entrenched elevated shooters wasn't a tactical decision, it was the decision the shooters wanted them to make. Pull back to the limousine, Anthony said into the radio. Both vehicles on the driver's side, tight to the canyon wall. Do not go up the hill. Harold's response was exactly what he expected it to be. He stopped listening to Harold. Vanessa was speaking from the rear compartment. He could see her in the mirror still on the floor, but raised enough to see him, watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely categorize. Not panic. Not the blank face of shock. Something more like the expression of someone who has just received information that rearranges everything they thought they understood about a situation. Who are you? She said again. Same question. Different weight. He almost answered. The smoke canister hit the road 20 feet in front of the limousine, and the canyon filled with gray. He already knew it was a diversion. Not because he was particularly smart, because he had read the attack pattern correctly. The elevated shooters, pushing them toward the canyon wall, the exits already blocked, the communication already dead. The point of all of this was to move the protected individual to a specific location. The smoke wasn't meant to blind them to the front. It was meant to pull their attention forward while the real strike came from behind. He was already looking in the mirror when the black SUV came through the smoke from the direction of the maintenance truck. He had 3 seconds. He used them. He didn't accelerate. He reversed hard, and at a specific angle that put the reinforced rear quarter panel of the limousine between the incoming SUV and Vanessa Carter's position. He turned into the impact rather than away from it, using the limousine's armored weight the way he'd been trained to use it, not as a vehicle to escape in, but as a weapon in its own right. The black SUV hit the limousine's rear hip at something close to 40 miles an hour. The limousine moved 18 inches. The black SUV stopped. Then Anthony pinned. It kept his foot down, used the limousine's weight against the canyon wall, held the attacking vehicle immobile, while he pulled Vanessa Carter out through the far door with one hand, eyed and guided her into the stone drainage channel that ran along the inside edge of the road. She said something against the noise of everything happening around them. He couldn't hear it. He put his body between her and the direction of the ridgeline and stayed there while the sound of secondary fire reached them from above. Then he found the radio. It was lying near the drainage channel dropped by one of Harold Reed's security team in the movement away from the SUV. Not a Convoy radio, different frequency, different housing. He picked it up because it was there, and because in a situation with no information, any information had value. He put it to his ear. The voice that came through was calm, professional. Speaking to someone identified only as Reed, using words that should not have existed. Crown has left Fortress, switching to Black Pine Protocol. Anthony went still. He knew what Crown meant. Crown was the designation assigned to the protected individual during a specific Carter Dynamics security briefing. A briefing that had taken place that morning in the executive garage, attended by Harold Reed and the senior security team. The designation existed for operational security to prevent the protected individual's name from being used on open radio channels. He knew what Fortress meant. He knew because he had spent the past 2 hours in that vehicle, and Fortress was the internal code name for the limousine itself, a code name that existed in Harold Reed's operational protocol documentation, and nowhere else. He knew what Black Pine was. He knew because he had heard Harold Reed use the phrase twice in the pre-convoy briefing, referring to it as the emergency extraction protocol he had personally designed for high-risk scenarios. And he knew that no one outside the convoy's inner security circle had any legitimate way to know all 3 of those designations on the same morning they had been assigned. Vanessa Carter was beside him in the drainage channel, close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. Who has the full protective plan for today? She was still processing the speed of everything that had happened, but she answered. She answered because she was, under everything else, a precise person, and precision meant answering direct questions directly. Harold Reed, Lorraine Mitchell, Thomas Park and Walter Ames from the board, and me. Anthony looked at her. One of them, he said, wants you gone. Above them, Harold Reed's voice came through the convoy radio, demanding they come back out, claiming he had the situation under control, using the exact tone of someone who wanted to be heard more than someone who had anything to say. And Anthony looked up over the edge of the drainage channel at the position where Harold was standing. Harold Reed was standing next to the men who had been shooting at them, not in their custody, not restrained, not being held at gunpoint or backed against the canyon wall, or showing any of the indicators of a man who had been forced into proximity with hostile actors. He was standing beside them, the way a person stands beside colleagues, close, relaxed, his arms at his sides, looking not at the attackers around him, but toward the drainage channel, where Anthony and Vanessa had taken cover. Looking for them, Vanessa saw it. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say about a man you had worked beside for 4 years, trusted with your schedule and your habits and your vulnerabilities, who was standing on the wrong side of gunfight without a scratch on him. There was no language adequate to that particular revelation. so she didn't try to find it. Anthony was already thinking forward. The drainage channel connected to the old mining infrastructure. At the base of the mountain, he knew this from the topographic map. Redstone, Colorado, had a network of old coal extraction tunnels dating from the early 20th century, sealed now but accessible, the kind of thing that showed up on geological survey overlays if you thought to look for them, which the Convoy's digital-only navigation would never have flagged. He had looked for them. He had noted the access point. He had done this because he had learned 12 years ago. At a cost he would never finish paying. That the difference between surviving a compromised convoy and not surviving one came down entirely to what you knew about the terrain before the shooting started. The drainage channel was 10 feet wide, running with an inch of cold water from the recent rain. He guided Vanessa through it, keeping himself between her and the ridgeline above until they reached the rusted grate that marked the old tunnel access. It was locked, technically. The lock was 40 years old. He opened it, and as he pulled the grate aside and helped Vanessa through and felt the cold air of the tunnel close around them, Harold Reed's voice came through the radio one more time, calm and certain, in a way that made the cold air feel colder. "Wilson, bring her out. I'm handling this." Anthony looked back through the grate at the canyon, at the burning lead SUV, at the blocked road and the smoke settling over everything, and Harold Reed standing among the men who had just tried to capture the CEO of Carter Dynamics, standing there like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I know exactly what you're handling," Anthony said quietly, to no one in particular. Then he pulled the grate closed behind them and walked into the dark. The tunnel smelled like 1987. That was the closest Anthony could get to it. Not a year he'd spent underground. Not a year he'd spent anywhere near Redstone, Colorado. But the smell had that specific quality of something that had been sealed away from the present for a long time, iron and wet stone, and the particular staleness of air that hadn't moved since before Brenda was born. The flashlight function on his phone threw a pale cone ahead of them, enough to see the old timber supports running along the ceiling at 8-foot intervals, enough to see the track grooves worn into the floor by ore carts that hadn't run since his parents were children. Vanessa Carter was keeping pace beside him. Not behind him, beside him. He noticed that. Filed it. She had taken off her heels at the grate without being told, was carrying them in her left hand, moving on stock-inged feet across the tunnel floor with a focused, deliberate quiet that told him she had made a decision somewhere in the drainage channel, some internal recalibration that had shifted her from the woman who told him to keep the line on Federal Boulevard to whatever she was becoming in this tunnel. He didn't know what to call it yet. But it was different, and different right now was useful. Her shoulder had stopped bleeding on its own mostly. The strip of his jacket sleeve he'd pressed against the wound before they moved had done enough. She hadn't complained about it, hadn't mentioned it again. He registered this as information about her, the same way he registered everything, not with admiration, not with judgment, just as data that updated his picture of who he was working with. They walked for 90 seconds in silence before she spoke. "You drove for the federal government." Not a question, a repetition of what he'd said in the car, returned now with different weight behind it, like a phrase she'd been holding in her hand and had finally decided to examine. He kept moving. "Yes, that's what you said. Yes, what you did in that canyon wasn't motor pool work." He didn't answer that one. The tunnel curved slightly left ahead, the flashlight catching the curve's edge, and not much beyond it. He slowed by 3 degrees of pace, enough to listen before committing to the turn. Nothing. Just the drip of groundwater somewhere deeper in, and the faraway sound of what was probably wind through a ventilation shaft. He rounded the curve. She stayed with him, half a step back on the right. "I need to know who I'm with." Her voice had a quality he respected, not demanding, not frightened, just direct. The voice of a person who had been making high-stakes decisions in incomplete information environments for long enough to know that gathering data was always more productive than panic. Because what I saw back there, the way you moved, the decisions you made, the sequence you ran on the vehicle that was trained, that was not someone who drove congressmen to committee hearings. He stopped at a section where the tunnel widened slightly, where an old equipment alcove opened on the left. He checked it empty, just the rusted outline of something that had once been machinery bolted to the stone floor. Satisfied, he turned and looked at her directly, which he hadn't done much. It was a professional habit, keeping attention outward, but they were underground now, and outward was a tunnel, so direct was appropriate. Counter-assault team, he said. Secret Service, 8 years. The silence had a different texture than the ones before it. She was processing, not pausing. Processing the gap between what she'd assumed and what she'd just been handed. You protected the president. Among others. Yes. And then what? This was the part he didn't talk about, hadn't talked about. The part that existed in the negative space of 12 years of not talking in the Aurora apartment, in the Sunday dinners with Brenda, where she was careful not to ask about work, in the dozen jobs that came and went between then and now, none of them asking much about his history, because none of them had reason to, but they were underground. The woman beside him had a piece of glass in her shoulder, and the head of her security team was standing in a canyon with the people who'd just tried to abduct her, and she had asked. So he told of it. But enough. He told her about Arizona, the convoy, the route change, the backup channel already dead before they entered the kill zone, the way the attack had unfolded with a precision that only made sense if someone inside the operation had provided detailed advance information. He told her about Terry Coleman, who had been his partner for 8 years, and who had died in Anthony's arms, on a piece of desert highway, with a bullet in his chest that should never have been there. He told her what Terry had said. Somebody, on our side, let them in. He told her about the investigation that had followed the finding that Agent Wilson had altered the formation without authorization, the sealed file, the career that ended not with termination, but with a conversation in a conference room, where 2 people who couldn't look at him directly told him that the agency appreciated his service, and that his separation would be handled with discretion, which was a word that meant nobody would discuss what had actually happened. He didn't tell her about Patricia. He didn't tell her about selling the house, about the years of night shifts and temporary shifts, temporary contracts, and the particular endurance required to raise a daughter properly, when everything you'd built your life around had been taken from you by people who found it convenient. Some things you held back, not out of pride, out of the simple understanding that certain information belonged to you, and you were allowed to keep it. Vanessa listened without interrupting. He would remember that. Most people interrupted, filled silences, offered responses, redirected toward their own experience. She listened until he was finished, and then she was quiet. For a moment, that felt respectful rather than empty. You were blamed for a failure that someone else caused. Yes, and the person who actually caused it, never found. The file was sealed before the investigation got that far. Another silence then, until today. He looked at her. She met the look steadily. Whoever organized this attack used the same operational signature, she said. Route changed at the last moment. Secondary communication down before departure. Lead vehicle targeted first. Security team pushed away from the principal vehicle, and the internal code words in the hands of the attackers before we ever entered the canyon. She paused. You've been looking at this since the garage, since 4:31 this morning. Something moved through her expression, not guilt, not quite. Something that was trying to be more honest than guilt, which required acknowledging not just that she'd been wrong, but specifically how, and in what direction. I told you to keep the line. You did. I told you that multiple times. Yes. And you... She stopped. Started again. You kept the information to yourself because you knew I wasn't listening. He didn't confirm or deny it. I kept it to myself because I didn't have proof yet. Information without evidence isn't protection. It's just noise. She absorbed this. Then quietly, Raymond Harris, his attention sharpened. He'd been moving them forward, as they talked, keeping pace, not stopping. Because stopping underground, with unknown pursuers, and a compromised surface team was the kind of decision you made only when you had a better reason than conversation. But something in the way she said the name made him slow. Why him? Because Aegis isn't what the company tells the board it is. She said it with the steadiness of someone who had been carrying a weight and had decided the carrying cost more than the sharing. Everyone on the public side thinks it's an energy storage prototype. Advanced battery technology for commercial infrastructure. That's the version that went to the SEC filing, and the press release, and the shareholder presentation. She looked at him. The actual system manages power distribution for strategic government facilities, federal installations. The algorithm controls load balancing across a network that includes 14 installations that I am not supposed to name in an unsecured environment. He kept his face neutral, but he was running the implications, and they were significant. If someone with Pinnacle Meridian's infrastructure got the algorithm, they could falsify performance data during government testing, kill our contract, buy Carter Dynamics stock when it collapses, and then acquire the technology through a distressed purchase at a fraction of actual value. Her voice was even, precise. She had done the math on this before, had clearly done it many times, which suggested she had understood the threat existed and had been running it as a background concern for longer than today. Raymond Harris has wanted this technology since before we filed the first patent application. He doesn't want to compete with it, he wants to own it, and he supplied communication systems to federal installations about 12 years ago. The pause was brief, one breath. The timing matches Arizona. Yes, she was quiet for 10 steps. Then there's something else. He waited. The authentication key for the Aegis system isn't in the corporate vault. She raised her right hand, the one not carrying her heels, and he looked at the ring on her middle finger. A plain band, dark metal, not particularly notable. It's here. Biometric chip. The system won't unlock without it and without my specific physiological signature, which means they need you conscious and cooperative. The picture assembled itself with the clean logic of a thing that had been true all along and simply needed the right information to become visible. Not dead, not unconscious. They need you to open it willingly, or at minimum to be present and alive while they compel you to. Which is why the shooters weren't aiming at me. Which is why the shooters weren't aiming at you. She looked at the ring for a moment, then back at the tunnel ahead. Only one person at Carter Dynamics knows the key is in this ring rather than in the vault. He already knew who she was going to say. The name had been sitting in the back of his mind since she'd listed the 4 people with access to the full protective plan, because there was one of those 4 names that carried a specific quality, the quality of someone positioned close enough, trusted deeply enough, and present in enough of the right conversations to have assembled every piece of information that the attackers had used today. Lorraine Mitchell. She didn't answer immediately. He watched something cross her face that he recognized the specific resistance of a person confronting a truth about someone they care about. Not denial, the thing that comes just before you stop denying, when the evidence has reached a weight that the alternative requires too much energy to maintain. She stood beside me, Vanessa said. Not defending, just stating. After my father died, when the board tried to force a restructuring that would have gutted everything he built, she was the vote that held it together, I know. She's been at my shoulder for 9 years. I know that too. He kept his voice even, not unkind. And I'm asking you to consider whether she was loyal to you or loyal to what you could give her. The tunnel opened slightly ahead, wider section where 2 passages had once joined. The right branch now collapsed into rubble. He checked the rubble out of habit. Solid, not recent. They stayed left. Vanessa didn't say anything for a while. He gave her the silence because some truths needed room to settle. He heard the sound 20 feet before the alcove. Not much. A shift of weight on stone. The particular quality of someone trying to hold still and not quite managing it. He put his left arm out a signal, not a grab, and Vanessa stopped without being told. He moved ahead alone, slowly, kept the phone light angled down to minimize how far it projected, which meant he was navigating more by the faint ambient light from a crack in the tunnel wall above than by his own source. He reached the alcove entrance and stopped with his back to the wall. Two people. He could hear two separate patterns of breathing. He looked around the edge. Darnell Cooper was the one he recognized, the younger of Harold's security team, mid-30s, built like someone who took the physical requirements of the job seriously. He was on his side against the alcove wall, with his wrists secured behind him with electrical cable, the kind you found in old mining. Infrastructure, flexible and strong. The man beside him was similarly restrained, similar age, someone Anthony knew by face from the garage that morning but whose name he hadn't caught. Both men were alive, both conscious, both with a particular look of people who have been sitting in the dark for an unknown period and have time to work through every interpretation of their situation and arrive at the least comfortable one. Anthony crouched in front of Darnell, kept his voice low. "You're going to feel the cable loosen. Don't move until I tell you." Darnell's eyes found him in the dim light. Something shifted in them, not relief. Exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has just discovered that the situation is not entirely beyond intervention. Vanessa appeared in the alcove entrance. She'd moved up behind him without sound, which he noted. She looked at the two bound men, and then at Anthony, and he could see her fitting this into the larger picture. Two of Harold's own team, restrained, left in the dark. The cable came free on both men after 3 minutes of work. Darnell sat up slowly, worked his wrists, took the water Anthony offered from the tunnel's emergency supply cache, another detail from the topographic study, old MSHA, requirement, still stocked by some automation he hadn't expected to still be functioning. "Reed opened the door," Darnell said. His voice was the voice of someone who had decided to skip past any part of this that wasn't operationally necessary to communicate. The security vehicle. He unlocked it from the inside while we were still moving through the canyon entrance. The attack team came in through that door. We tried to stop it and he didn't finish, didn't need to. He reached into his jacket. The motion was slow, careful, the motion of someone who understood that men who had been recently freed from restraints making sudden movements was a bad combination. He produced a small recording device, the kind that clipped to a shirt pocket, the kind that ran on its own battery independent of the vehicle's systems. I activate this when something feels wrong. Force of habit from a previous job. He held it out. I got about 40 seconds of Reed talking to someone outside the vehicle before they took me down. I don't know if it's enough. Anthony took it, pressed play, held it up so both he and Vanessa could hear. The audio was compressed, muffled by the vehicle door, but Harold Reed's voice came through clearly enough. Not the words, not at first, but the tone. The tone of someone who was not being compelled, who was issuing updates, not responding to threats, and then, clearing slightly, a fragment. Transfer protocol confirmed. Extraction point at Ridge. Confirmed timeline for. And then the sound of the door and Darnell's voice shouting and the audio ending. Vanessa looked at the device in Anthony's hand for a moment. Then she looked at the tunnel wall. Her jaw was set in the way of a person pressing down hard on something that otherwise would come up through their chest. "Good," she said. One word. Then she looked at Darnell. "Can you walk?" "Yes, both of you." The second man, whose name turned out to be Marcus Okafor, late 30s, 6 feet, a bruise forming under his left eye from whatever had put him on the ground in the security vehicle, said, "I can walk." Anthony was already moving. Hydroelectric plant. Northwest from here, old access road runs alongside the eastern tunnel branch. Pre-digital phone infrastructure. Analog landline if it's still connected. He looked at Darnell. "It's still connected." Darnell blinked. "How do you know that?" Topographic survey includes utility infrastructure overlays. The line runs to an emergency communication box on the plant's eastern wall. It was flagged as maintained as recently as the last federal survey of the area, which was 4 years ago. He looked at the group. "We move." The plant was 1.5 miles through the tunnel system, and then across 200 yards of open terrain. that Anthony did not like at all. Open terrain, right now, with at least one attack team still operating in the canyon, and Harold Reed's position unknown, was the kind of exposure he'd been trained to minimize at every opportunity. But the alternative was staying in the tunnel indefinitely, which solved nothing, and allowed the opposition's timeline, whatever that timeline was, to run uncontested. He thought about the recording, about the phrase extraction point at Ridge, about Redstone Ridge, which was the destination they'd been driving toward when the convoy entered the canyon, about the fact that the destination hadn't changed, only the people who would be arriving there. He thought about what Vanessa had said about Aegis, about what it actually controlled. He thought about Raymond Harris supplying communication systems to federal installations 12 years ago, around the time someone provided detailed route information to the people who killed Terry Coleman in Arizona. He ran the math. 12 years ago, someone had fed operational intelligence to Harris's operation, that someone had been inside the convoy's security structure, inside it, deeply enough to know the route, the channel assignments, the formation, the timing. The investigation had concluded that Anthony Wilson had created the vulnerability. The investigation had been wrong, which meant someone had managed the investigation's conclusion, which meant someone had been willing and able to shape a federal inquiry from the inside. Harold Reed had been working in federal contractor security in Arizona 12 years ago. He hadn't known that until 40 seconds ago when Darnell, moving through the tunnel beside him, mentioned it in passing that Reed had come from a federal contractor background in the Southwest before he moved to corporate security. That Reed had come with strong references from people whose names Darnell didn't know. References that Harold had never needed to explain, because the references had been good enough that nobody asked follow-up questions. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. Not with obvious malice, with patience, with a cover that looked like a career, that looked like competence, that looked like exactly the kind of background a head of corporate security was supposed to have. And then, when the right target presented itself, when the right contract came into play, when the right technology arrived that was worth enough to justify the risk the patience paid off, the plant materialized at the end of the tunnel branch, a concrete structure the size of a large warehouse, built into the hillside in a way that made it look like the hill had simply decided to become industrial. The turbine housings were still intact, which Anthony noted as both architecturally impressive and structurally concerning, because intact turbines could be activated, and activated turbines in a confined space were a variable he'd prefer not to be dealing with. The eastern wall had the communication box. He found it in 30 seconds, because he'd known where to look. The panel was locked. The lock was the same vintage as the tunnel's grate and required approximately the same approach. Inside the panel, the handset was yellowed but intact. He pressed it to his ear. Dial tone. He dialed from memory. The number existed in a part of his mind that didn't organize by intention. It was just there, the way the 4:30 wake-up was just there, installed so deeply over so many years that forgetting it would require forgetting himself. Catherine Hill's voice answered on the third ring. He hadn't spoken to her in 4 years. Their last contact had been a brief message. She'd sent it. He'd read it. He hadn't responded, because responding would have meant engaging with a part of his history that he'd decided to leave sealed. But she'd sent it anyway. That was Catherine. She sent things knowing you might not respond, because she believed in the value of the sending regardless of the receiving. Arizona is happening again, he said. Not hello, not preamble, just that. The pause was short, 2 seconds, maybe 3. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone snapping from one mode to another the way certain people could. Location. He gave her the coordinates of the plant. He gave her the convoy composition. He gave her Harold Reed's name, and he gave her Raymond Harris's name. And he said, Aegis, Federal Strategic Infrastructure, you need to know what it actually controls. Get that to the right people before anything else moves. Federal response team is 40 minutes out, Catherine said. The moment I hang up, I am reopening the Arizona case file. Darnell Cooper's recording is enough to start. Anthony, I know, you don't have federal protective authority. I don't need a title to bring an innocent person home. He said it simply, without drama, the way you say things that are just true. 40 minutes. Tell them to approach from the northern access road. The canyon route is still compromised. He hung up, he turned, and every light in the plant came on at once. Harold Reed appeared on a monitor, mounted above the turbine housing a security feed, cycling through 4 views of the plant's interior. And there was Harold's face, on the center screen, looking at them, from wherever he was looking from, wearing the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for. Wilson. Harold's voice came through the plant's intercom, which meant he was either inside the structure or had remote access to its systems, which meant neither option was good. Bring her out. This has already gone further than it needed to. Anthony scanned the room. Darnell was at the far wall near the secondary door. Okafor was near the main entrance. Vanessa was behind Anthony, which was exactly where she should be, relative to the primary threat direction, which was currently everywhere. The electronic door locks engaged with a sound like a small punctuation mark, all of them, simultaneously, which meant Harold was running the building's security system remotely. Then the sound of water, not a drip, a flow. The flood release system. The plant had used water from the runoff channels to power its turbines, and those channels could be reversed. And the sound, now coming from the lower level, was the sound of water moving in the wrong direction for everything to be fine. He looked at the stairway to the upper level, looked at the secondary access corridor that ran along the plant's northern wall, looked at Vanessa. He wants us out of the control area, she said. Yes, the communication box is in the control area, was. Calls already made. Something that might have been relief crossed her face, and disappeared, crossed her face, and immediately, replaced by the particular focus of someone who has processed that the immediate crisis is not resolved by one phone call, and has moved on to the next problem. What do we do? He looked at the layout of the plant, at the monitor showing Harold's face, at the flood system activating in the lower level, at the doors that were locked and the 40 minutes that hadn't passed yet. We split, he said. He laid it out quickly, Darnell and Okafor to the roof access, which Harold would not have thought to lock, because roof access in a flood scenario was not a tactical concern from Harold's perspective. Vanessa to the transmission room with Darnell's recording, because the plant's transmission equipment might still carry a signal on a frequency the jammers weren't covering. Anthony would stay. Vanessa started to object. He cut it short. If Harold sees me going for the transmission room, he deploys everything in that direction. He doesn't know the recording exists. He doesn't know you know about Lorraine. He thinks his primary leverage is still the ambush pattern that we're running scared and separated and trying to get out. He looked at her directly. If you're in the transmission room with that recording and an active signal, you have what you need. And if he reaches you before the federal team does, then he reaches me. He kept his voice level. Not brave. Practical. Harold Reed and I have some old business to finish regardless. She looked at him for a moment. In that moment, something passed between them that wasn't warm exactly, and wasn't professional exactly, and wasn't something he had a clean category for. It was the look of two people who had been through enough in the past several hours that certain formalities had burned away. And what was left underneath was the unadorned fact of two human beings deciding to trust each other. She went. He watched her go, watched Darnell take the lead, watched Okafor cover the rear, watched them move down the north corridor with the quiet efficiency of people who had a specific destination and a very strong reason to reach it. And then he turned and walked toward the turbine room. Harold found him there, 8 minutes later. The water was at Anthony's ankles by then, cold and fast-moving, filling the lower section of the turbine room from the reversed intake channels. The room was loud, the water, the residual hum of the turbine housings, the particular acoustics of a large concrete space that turned every sound into multiple sounds. Harold came in through the southern access door with two of his men, and then he sent his men back, which told Anthony something important. Harold wanted this conversation, not just the resolution of it. He stopped 10 feet away, looked at Anthony the way you look at something you've been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to put down. You drove for a contract company, Harold said. You are standing in an old flood room in the middle of nowhere, because someone made a call this morning and you happened to be available. He paused. You know what's funny about that? Anthony waited. The water was moving around his ankles, measuring time. I chose you. Harold said it with a precise, careful clarity, like a man unwrapping a gift he's been saving. The regular driver didn't call in sick. I had his assignment changed at 4 a.m. I pulled your file, I put you on the call sheet, and I made sure you were in that garage this morning. He let that settle. Raymond needed the last witness from Arizona removed, and I needed it done in a way that looked like a casualty of the operation, rather than a deliberate target. He looked almost satisfied. You were supposed to die in the canyon, Wilson, not survive it. The water was at mid-calf now, cold in a way that clarified thinking. You sold the Arizona route, Anthony said. Not a question. Raymond Harris was running a federal acquisition operation that would have made everyone involved very comfortable. The Convoy was the last obstacle. Harold's voice was the voice of a man who had made his peace with what he'd done so long ago that it no longer required any effort to discuss. Your formation change complicated things. Coleman got in the way of something that wasn't meant for him, and you were the available explanation. Terry Coleman had 2 children. That's unfortunate. Anthony looked at him. 12 years of the particular weight of knowing something was true and having no way to prove it. 12 years of the sealed file, and the career ended in a conference room. And the words that meant nothing and covered everything. And now Harold Reed, standing in a flooding turbine room, telling him he'd been right all along, in the tone of someone who believes that being candid about something they did confers some kind of absolution. You should be grateful you're still here, Harold said. A lot of people in your position wouldn't be. People in my position, Anthony kept his voice even. You mean people who did their job correctly. Something shifted in Harold's face. The satisfaction changed to something cooler. He came forward, closing the 10 feet to 6, and Anthony could see that Harold was genuinely confident in this space. He knew the room, knew the water levels, knew the machinery. He'd been here before. He'd planned for this. He moved with the particular assurance of a man fighting on terrain he chose. They went through the machinery. That's the most accurate description of it. Not a choreographed exchange a working through. Harold used the turbine housings as cover and leverage, used the water to slow Anthony's movement while using machinery footholds to keep himself out of it. He was strong, and he was technically competent, and he knew every protrusion and every gap in that room, which counted for a significant amount when the lighting was poor and the floor was underwater, and the sound made it difficult to locate movement by ear. Anthony was better, not dramatically better, not so much better that it was clean, but better in the specific ways that mattered in reading the next movement from the current one, in adjusting his own position to the floor beneath the water that he couldn't see but had mapped in the first 30 seconds, in the fundamental difference between a man who had trained to stop violence and a man who had trained to use it. Harold put him down twice. Anthony came back up both times. The third time, Harold tried to force him down onto the maintenance platform below the turbine housing, with 6 inches of cold water already over its surface. Anthony read it coming 2 seconds out and turned into it instead of away, which meant the impact was on his terms rather than Harold's, which meant Harold ended up off balance in the water rather than Anthony pinned beneath the turbine. He had Harold at the maintenance ladder when the secondary turbine activated. The sound was enormous. Not mechanical noise, a physical pressure that occupied the entire room at once. The kind of sound that doesn't leave space for anything else. The blast of pressurized steam from the secondary housing drove Harold backward, drove him stumbling through the ankle-deep water to the far wall, and in the sudden reorientation of the room, Anthony found the emergency hatch beside the north exit that he'd noted when he first entered and hadn't been able to reach until now. Vanessa pulled it open from the other side. He stopped moving for 1 complete second. Just stopped. Because she was supposed to be in the transmission room. She was supposed to be as far from this room as she could get. "I sent the recording," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that had nothing performative about it, not bravery for its own sake, just the steadiness of someone who had done what needed doing and was now doing the next thing. Catherine Hill's canned frequency picked it up, and then I came back. He looked at her. "You came back for me 3 times today," she said. "I thought I'd try it once myself." He couldn't find an answer to that, so he went through the hatch. They came out on the plant's upper level, a service corridor running above the main floor, exposed metal grating that rang under their feet and showed them the flooded turbine room below through its mesh. Darnell and Okafor were already up here, at the roof access ladder. Harold's voice came through the intercom again, closer now, from somewhere inside the building. And then through the narrow east-facing window, Anthony saw the helicopter. No running lights on the tail, no identification markings on the body, coming in from the southeast at a low angle, dropping altitude in the way of something that knows exactly where it's going, not searching. Vanessa moved to the window beside him. "Raymond's people," she said, reading the same thing he was reading. Then quieter, he came himself, which changed the calculation. Raymond Harris in a helicopter above this plant meant the timeline had moved. The plan was no longer operating through Harold. As primary agent, Raymond had decided direct control was necessary, which meant Harold's operation had not gone the way it was supposed to, which meant Raymond was improvising, which was either an advantage or a threat, and Anthony had about 45 seconds to determine which. Harold appeared at the corridor entrance from the south stairwell. He looked at Anthony, at Vanessa, at the helicopter dropping toward the parking area visible through the west windows, and something on Harold's face, the controlled composure. The deliberate authority cracked along a fault line that had apparently been there all along, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure. "Raymond doesn't trust you anymore," Anthony said. He said it not to wound, but because it was operationally true, and Harold needed to hear it framed correctly. "You told him the operation was managed. He's in a helicopter above this plant. Those two things don't go together." Harold's jaw moved. Nothing came out. "He's not coming to collect Vanessa," Anthony continued. "He's coming to see what went wrong. And when Raymond Harris comes to see what went wrong, the person who ran the operation that went wrong tends not to be around for the debrief." The helicopter settled out of sight below the west windows. The sound of its rotors changed landing, powering down. Harold looked at the window, looked at Anthony, looked at Vanessa, and the look wasn't what Anthony expected. Wasn't the look of a man calculating how to use her. It was the look of a man calculating how fast everything around him was collapsing and whether the collapse could be managed. It couldn't. Anthony knew it couldn't. And in the next 5 seconds, Harold knew it too. Because the sound of voices came from the floor below, and the voices were not the voices of the 2 remaining members of Harold's team. They were Raymond Harris's people. Coming up. Harold made a decision. Anthony saw the moment it happened a particular kind of stillness, the kind that precedes movement in a specific direction. He sprinted past Anthony toward the roof access ladder, past Darnell and Okafor, taking the rungs 3 at a time. Anthony looked at Vanessa. "The control room," he said. "He's going for the main system." She was already moving. Above them, through the roof access, the sound of Harold Reed's footsteps crossed to the main control panel, and then the sound of manual overrides being engaged, specific, sequential, the sound of someone who knew exactly which controls to reach for, and then the alarm, not the intercom, the facility alarm, the flood system, the pressure release, the overload warning, all of it together, rising in the enclosed space of the upper corridor, like the building itself was making an argument. Vanessa grabbed his arm. "He's triggering the Aegis overload sequence remotely. This facility is a secondary test node. It's linked to Redstone Ridge's main system. If he completes the sequence..." "How long?" 6 minutes. He looked at the roof access. at the corridor leading to the transmission equipment, at the east window where Raymond Harris's helicopter had just set down. Raymond Harris, the man who had known Terry Coleman's name, who had said it with the specific recognition of someone who had been following that name for 12 years. Watching the file stay sealed, watching Anthony Wilson disappear into contract, driving and Aurora apartments and Sunday dinners that nobody outside the family cared about. The man who had built a 12-year strategy around a biometric key hidden in a ring and a board member who believed in shareholder value more than human loyalty, and a head of security who had decided one morning in Arizona that the right person to betray was the one who couldn't fight back. Raymond Harris was downstairs, and Harold Reed was upstairs with 6 minutes on a countdown. Anthony looked at Vanessa Carter. She didn't ask him what he was thinking. She already knew. And what she said, standing in a flooding hydroelectric plant in the mountains of Colorado, with everything that had happened in the past 6 hours compressed into the lines around her eyes, and the set of her jaw was this: we handle what's in front of us first. He nodded. They split. They split at the corridor junction, and Anthony went up. Not because up was safer, because up was where Harold Reed had gone. And Harold had 6 minutes, and a manual override panel, and the kind of motivated desperation that makes people faster than they would otherwise be. The math was simple. Anthony needed to reach Harold before Harold completed the sequence, and Raymond Harris's people were coming through the lower level, which meant every second spent navigating around them was a second Harold was using to end this on his own terms. He took the roof access ladder at a run. His boots hit each rung with the efficient percussion of someone who had trained on ladders, on stairs, on every kind of vertical surface that stood between a protected person and safety. His shoulder ached from where he'd hit the turbine housing in the flooding room below. He didn't slow for it. The roof access opened into a secondary control corridor narrower than the main floor, running the length of the plants up a structure with the main panel at the far end behind a glass and steel partition. Harold was already there, already at the panel, his hands moving across the manual override switches in a sequence that was neither random nor hesitant. The sequence of a man who had memorized this panel specifically, who had stood in front of it before, and learned it the way you learn something you intend to use. 5 minutes 40 seconds on the countdown clock mounted above the panel. Harold didn't turn when Anthony came through the door. He knew someone was coming. His body registered it without his hands stopping. "You have a choice," he said. Still not turning, hands still moving. "You can stop me, or you can get her out before the sequence completes. You can't do both." That's the third time today someone has tried to frame this as a binary. Harold's hands paused for exactly 1 second, then continued. "It's not a frame, it's arithmetic." Anthony crossed the corridor, 20 feet, 15. Harold turned when Anthony was 10 feet out. He'd been expecting it, had been calculating it, had timed the turn precisely to catch Anthony mid-approach when changing direction was expensive. He came forward instead of back, which was the right tactical instinct, closing the distances so that Anthony's momentum became a liability rather than an asset. They hit the near wall, hard enough to rattle the glass partition, and Harold was strong in the specific way of a man who had kept himself in physical condition, not for vanity, but for moments like this one. But Anthony had fought in tighter spaces than this, had trained in rooms smaller than this corridor, against people who were better than Harold, at every component of this exchange. What Harold had was preparation and desperation. What Anthony had was everything else. 4 minutes 20 seconds. They went through the corridor the way they'd gone through the turbine room, working, not performing, using the walls and the floor, and each other's momentum as variables rather than obstacles. Harold landed 2 strikes that Anthony would feel tomorrow in the specific localized way of damage that is significant without being disabling. Anthony landed 3 that changed the geometry of Harold's posture, not dropping him, but shifting the weight distribution, loading the left side, making the right side available. Harold grabbed the partition rail at 3 minutes 50 seconds and held on, not to recover, to talk. You know what you were to them, Harold said. His breathing was controlled, a man pacing himself. The agency. You were a convenient answer to an inconvenient question. They didn't care what actually happened in Arizona. They cared what the file said happened, and the file said what I needed it to say. He looked at Anthony with something that was not regret and was not satisfaction but existed in the space between them. You want to know the worst part? If you'd fought it, if you'd pushed back, hired a lawyer, made noise, you might have won. But you walked away, so I assumed you understood the deal. The deal was that Terry Coleman's family deserved to know what happened to him. Harold blinked. It wasn't the response he'd prepared for. That was the deal, Anthony said. Not my career. Not my file. Terry had a daughter and a son, and they spent 12 years thinking their father died because of a mistake. That's what you bought with Raymond Harris's money. That's what you sold. Something moved through Harold's face. Not remorse. It was too late in the sequence for remorse, to be honest. But something. The flicker of a man who had built a careful architecture around what he'd done and had just found one load-bearing wall that didn't hold. He recovered, pushed off the rail and came back. 3 minutes 10 seconds. Anthony put him down at 2 minutes 45. Not cleanly, Harold went down fighting and came back up twice, and the second time Anthony had to pin him against the panel itself to stop the upswing. When Harold finally stayed down, hands behind him, wrist locked, not from zip ties because Anthony didn't have any, but from the precise application of a joint control technique that made movement acutely inadvisable, he was breathing in the measured way of a man managing pain. Override code, Anthony said. His voice was level, not threatening, just informational. The countdown needs a second-level clearance to halt. You know that code? Harold looked at the ceiling, said nothing. 2 minutes 15 seconds. Anthony thought about the garage that morning, about Harold opening the security vehicle's internal door lock from inside, preparing for departure, running the vehicle's systems check. Anthony had been crouching at the rear wheel well, photographing the scratch on the communication housing, and Harold had been 12 feet away, not looking at him, because drivers didn't warrant looking at. Harold's fingers on the keypad, a sequence, not hurried. The particular rhythm of a sequence someone had entered so many times it had become a motor memory, the hands knowing it without the brain needing to consciously recall it. Anthony had filed it, the same way he filed everything. He recited the sequence aloud. Harold's head came up off the ceiling. Anthony repeated it, calmly, precisely. Each digit in order, the same rhythm he'd seen Harold's hands produce in the garage that morning. Harold's mouth opened and then closed. Administrative override, Anthony said. You used it across multiple systems. Because muscle memory is more reliable than written notes, which is professionally sound, except that muscle memory doesn't know when it's being observed. He looked at the countdown panel. 2 minutes even. Vanessa needs to enter it. Tell me if it's right, or tell me to try it and find out. The silence lasted 4 seconds, which at this point in the morning was a significant expenditure of time. It's right, Harold said. Flat, defeated in a specific, technical way, not broken, not remorseful, but correctly understanding that the particular game he'd been playing since 4 a.m. had reached its conclusion. It's right. Anthony moved. The Aegis control room was 2 floors down, and at the opposite end of the facility from where Anthony had left Vanessa. He knew this because Vanessa had described the facility layout to him in the tunnel, in the terse, efficient way she described everything, covering the essential geometry without ornament. He moved through the upper corridor and hit the main stairwell, and came down at a pace that would have been a run if the stairwell had been wider. Raymond Harris was in the Aegis control room. Anthony heard his voice before he saw him, the particular register of a man who believed he was speaking from a position of unchallenged authority, which is a recognizable quality, distinct from the register of a man who actually has unchallenged authority. Raymond Harris, based on available evidence, had spent a significant portion of his adult life performing the latter while operating from the former, and the performance had been good enough that most people around him had never noticed the difference. Vanessa was inside. Anthony could hear that too, her voice lower, controlled, reading something, a statement. Something formal in its cadence, the specific formality of a prepared text, which meant Raymond had her reading a prepared text, which meant whatever was happening inside that room was designed to look a particular way for a camera or a recording device. He was 8 feet from the control room door when 2 of Raymond's security team stepped into the corridor from a side passage. Not Harold's people. Raymond's own different jackets, different communication equipment, the particular alert posture of men who had been placed here specifically to manage exactly this kind of approach. Anthony stopped, assessed. The corridor was 11 feet wide, good overhead clearance, no furniture. 2 men, both well-trained based on their stance, both carrying sidearms that were currently holstered, but hands were not far. He had the administrative override code in his memory, and Vanessa inside that room, and 1 minute 45 seconds on a countdown, he couldn't see from here. He didn't have time for a prolonged engagement, so he didn't engage. He held up both hands open, empty, visible, and he said, "I have the authentication chip for the Aegis system. Without it, the overload sequence completes in approximately 90 seconds, and this facility ceases to exist along with everyone in it." He let that settle for 2 seconds. "Raymond Harris is in that room. He knows what the chip is. Ask him if he wants to talk to me." The taller of the 2 men held his position and spoke into his radio. The door opened. Raymond Harris was 60 years old and carried it the way certain powerful men carried age, not fighting it, but having decided at some point that the accumulation of years was itself a form of authority. He was broad through the chest, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that had survived the helicopter ride without visible damage, which said something about the suit and also about Raymond's priorities. He stood at the center of the Aegis control room the way he stood everywhere, apparently as though the room had been arranged around him, rather than him having entered it. Vanessa stood at the authentication panel. A camera on a tripod was pointed at her. She had a printed statement in her hands. She looked at Anthony when he came through the door, and the look said several things simultaneously, the most important of which was, "I know what I'm doing," and the second most important of which was, "The timing is very close. 1 minute 20 seconds. Mr. Wilson." Raymond said his name with the particular texture of recognition, not surprise, but the acknowledgement of something long anticipated. "Harold mentioned you might be persistent." "Harold mentioned a lot of things today." Raymond smiled, not warmly. The smile of a man who has filed the statement under known variable and moved on the chip, the countdown. Raymond looked at the panel, looked at Anthony, did the math that Anthony had already done. That, without the authentication chip, the sequence completed regardless, and without Anthony's cooperation, the chip wasn't accessible, and without the chip plus the override code in the correct sequence, the sequence completed regardless. He was good at math. He'd built a significant portion of his career on being better at it than the people around him. "Stop the sequence," Raymond said to the room at large, to whoever was managing the control panel behind him, authentication pending. The countdown did not stop. The person at the control panel turned to Raymond with the expression of someone delivering news they'd prefer not to deliver. The manual override was locked out from the upper level. Whoever ran the lockout used the administrative code. Raymond's smile disappeared. "Harold," Anthony said. "He locked it before I restrained him. He didn't want you to have the option of stopping it without the authentication chip. Which means he doesn't trust you any more than you trust him. Which means whatever arrangement you two had is currently in the process of dissolving. Which means the only person in this room with a working path to the override panel and the authentication chip and the biometric clearance to operate both is standing at that panel over there." Everyone looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Raymond Harris for a moment. Then she looked at Anthony. The look lasted about a second and a half. Then she turned back to the statement in her hands. 1 minute even. "I'll read the statement," she said. Raymond's attention snapped back to her. Anthony watched his posture change, the particular recalibration of a man who has been operating on a plan that just encountered an unexpected turn toward his preferred outcome. He was good enough at this that he didn't let relief show. Just returned to the position of authority and waited. Vanessa read. She read clearly, precisely. The statement described a voluntary technology transfer. Carter Dynamics authorizing Pinnacle Meridian's access to the Aegis algorithm in response to a corporate liquidity situation, the transfer occurring with full executive consent and without external compulsion. Raymond had written it carefully. Every phrase was designed to close a legal door. Every sentence built toward a record that would survive scrutiny. She read all of it, except for one phrase. The original text said, "In conditions free from third-party interference, reflecting the board's independent judgment." Vanessa read, "With consent preserved under Carter Protocol 7. Reflecting the board's independent judgment." Carter Protocol 7. Anthony didn't know what Carter Protocol 7 was. He wasn't supposed to know. It existed inside Carter Dynamics' legal infrastructure, embedded in the company's contract documentation, as a duress provision, a flag that activated when the signing executive inserted a specific phrase into an otherwise standard statement, triggering an automatic encrypted transmission to the company's outside legal counsel and the relevant federal regulatory body. The transmission carried the statement, the timestamp, and a duress indicator that the receiving systems were trained to recognize. It was a provision that Vanessa's father had put into the company's documents 30 years ago, when he was building Carter Dynamics from a regional operation into something national. He'd put it there because he'd come up in an industry where powerful people sometimes wanted things from smaller operators that the smaller operators had no safe way to refuse, and he believed in building exits into everything. Vanessa had grown up watching him build those exits. Raymond didn't catch it. His legal team, wherever they were, would catch it eventually, would flag the deviation, would understand what it meant. But in the room, right now, Raymond heard the statement read cleanly and nodded with the satisfaction of a man receiving what he came for. The camera continued recording, including the room, including Raymond's face, including the tripod and the prepared statement and the two armed men at the door, including everything that made the room look exactly like what it was, which was the compelled signing of a document under duress in a secured facility during an active criminal operation. 40 seconds. Vanessa set the statement down, looked at the authentication panel, looked at Raymond. "The chip," she said, "and the override code at the same time, or we're all standing in rubble in 40 seconds. Raymond nodded to the man at the control panel, who entered a sequence. The override lockout from the upper level cleared. Harold's last obstruction removed. The countdown continued. Now stoppable, but only with the chip. Vanessa raised her right hand, touched the ring, and paused. Anthony reached into his jacket pocket. He'd taken the chip when Vanessa handed it to him in the upper corridor. On the way down, a transfer so quick and quiet that Raymond's team, focused on the room's other dynamics, hadn't tracked it. The chip was a small thing, smaller than a fingernail. It sat in Anthony's palm now like a fact about the morning, small, specific. The distillation of everything that had happened since 4:31 a.m. He crossed the room. Raymond's people tensed. Raymond raised one hand hold because he understood that the chip needed to reach the panel, and the only path it had was through Anthony's legs. Anthony reached the panel. Vanessa was already there. She took the chip without drama, without ceremony, seated it in the reader, pressed her thumb to the biometric scanner, and entered the administrative override code that Anthony recited quietly beside her Harold Reed's muscle memory. 12 digits, the sequence he'd tapped into a keypad in the executive garage that morning, without knowing anyone was watching. 20 seconds. The panel accepted the chip, the biometric cleared, the override engaged. 10 seconds. The countdown stopped at 7, not 3, not the last instant drama of a second or less. 7 seconds, because the authentication sequence took 3 seconds to run, and Vanessa had started it at 10, and the math worked out to 7, which was not poetic, but was accurate, and accuracy was what the situation had required all day. The facility alarm changed pitch. From the ascending pattern of a countdown warning to the steady lower register of a system returning to baseline. The lights in the Aegis control room shifted, the red-tinged emergency overlay fading, replaced by the ordinary white of a facility operating normally. Silence relative to what had come before. Raymond Harris stood at the center of the room. His suit was still immaculate. His posture was still correct. But something behind his eyes had changed, the specific change that happens when a man who has been running a plan for 12 years watches the last component of that plan fail at a remove of 7 seconds. Anthony looked at him. Raymond looked back. "You held my partner while he was dying," Anthony said. "Not loudly, in Arizona. You weren't there, you were never there, you were always at a careful distance. But the people you sent were there, and they left him on the highway. Because he was a problem that had been resolved." He paused. "Terry Coleman had a daughter. She's 24 now. She's going to know what happened to her father." Raymond said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The door opened behind Anthony. Catherine Hill came in first, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected her team lead, expected someone she deputized, expected the 40-minute timeline to have produced a standard entry. But Catherine had come herself. 58 years old and still moving, with the efficiencies of someone who hadn't let the years slow the things worth keeping fast. Behind her came 4 members of the federal response team, and behind them 2 more. She looked at Anthony, at Vanessa, at the room. "Raymond Harris," she said, "you're being detained pending federal investigation into charges including kidnapping, sabotage of strategic federal infrastructure, and conspiracy in connection with an incident in Arizona 12 years ago." She said it cleanly, precisely, without performance. Then she looked at the man at the control panel and the 2 men at the door and the camera on its tripod. "Everybody else stays where they are. Raymond's people professionals." Whatever else they were complied. Raymond himself stood still for 5 more seconds. Then he let his hands be taken. Anthony watched it happen. Watched the restraints go on and watched Raymond Harris be walked toward the door and felt something that wasn't satisfaction, exactly, wasn't relief, was the specific absence of a weight he'd been carrying long enough, that he'd stopped, noticing it was there. Which you only discover, it's gone, the sudden lightness of a thing that has been resolved. Catherine came to him. She was carrying a metal document box, which struck him as an odd thing to bring to an active interdiction. Until she opened it. Inside, his Secret Service badge, the one that had been confiscated during his suspension 12 years ago, placed in a sealed file, with everything else sitting in federal storage for the duration of everything that had come after. Formal review was completed 40 minutes ago based on Darnell Cooper's recording and Harold Reed's on-site admission, Catherine said. "The Arizona file is open. The finding against you is vacated." She held the badge out, not ceremonially, just practically, the way you hand something back to someone it belongs to. "Your record is clean, Anthony." He took it, looked at it. The same photo, younger, obviously, a face that hadn't yet spent 12 years carrying what those years contained. His name in the standard government typeface, his rating, his assignment. He thought about Terry Coleman's daughter. 24 years old, same age as Brenda. A young woman who had grown up with the version of her father's death that Harold Reed had written. "When does the family notification happen?" Anthony asked. Catherine looked at him for a moment, not surprised by the question. She'd known him long enough to not be surprised by it. "We'll contact them through the Victim Services Division today. Full disclosure of the reopened investigation and the findings. She should hear it from someone who knew him." He looked at the badge. "Not from a form letter, I know." Catherine held his look. "We'll make that happen." Harold Reed was removed from the upper control corridor by 2 members of Catherine's team who found him where Anthony had left him, wrist-locked against the panel, waiting with the patience of a man who had understood, somewhere in the last 10 minutes, that patience was now his only remaining option. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He was walked down through the facility, with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had decided that dignity, at this stage, was the only thing still negotiable. Lorraine Mitchell was in Denver. She was in her office at Carter Dynamics, the executive floor, the same floor Vanessa's office occupied, 2 doors down from the corner suite when Catherine's federal team arrived. She was at her desk. She was, based on the account relayed to Vanessa later, in the process of drafting a public statement about Vanessa's disappearance. The statement framed it as a crisis, described the company's commitment to continuity, outlined a temporary leadership structure. The Carter Protocol 7 alert had arrived in the legal department 47 minutes before Catherine's team knocked on Lorraine Mitchell's office door. It had arrived as a red-flagged encrypted file to the company's outside counsel, who had immediately contacted federal regulatory offices, who had contacted Catherine's division. The authentication on the duress flag was unambiguous. The recording of Lorraine's conversation in the transmission room, Vanessa's voice, and Lorraine's voice, Lorraine's admission in her own words, transmitted on Catherine's frequency, was attached. Lorraine was still drafting when they came in. She looked up from her screen, and whatever she had expected this day to end with, it was not this, not the federal identification, not the quiet voices explaining what she was being charged with, not the careful, professional process of a thing she had arranged and managed and believed she controlled apart and in the space of one morning in ways she had not accounted for. She went quietly. That was the report. She went quietly, and she didn't speak to anyone except her attorney, who arrived 40 minutes later, and she sat in the federal holding facility with the particular composure, with the spent composure of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms full of powerful people learning how to show nothing on the outside. Anthony heard this secondhand from Vanessa 3 hours after the Aegis control room went quiet. They were outside the facility, by then the mountain air, doing what mountain air does, which carried the smell of pine and cold stone, in a way that is entirely indifferent to everything that has happened at altitude below it. Vanessa had a federal EMT working on her shoulder, replacing Anthony's improvised bandage with something more professionally calibrated. She was on her phone, had been on her phone in the sustained, focused way of someone managing 17 things at once, and she relayed the information about Lorraine in the interval between 2 calls, concisely, without emotion in her voice. Anthony sat on a concrete barrier 20 feet away and held his badge in both hands and thought about nothing in particular for about 4 minutes, which was possibly the first time he had done that since 4:30 a.m. Then Catherine came and sat beside him. Preston Vale's team picked up Raymond's helicopter pilot, she said. Zoe. Pilot confirmed the Redstone Ridge approach was planned from the start. Raymond intended to be there for the authentication himself, not to take delivery of it afterward. He wanted to watch it happen. She paused. He's that kind of man. I know what kind of man he is. The Arizona charge is going to be the one that sticks longest, Catherine said. Conspiracy in the death of a federal officer. The other charges have more documentation, but that one has weight. He nodded. You're going to be asked to testify. I know. It's going to be a significant ask. The trial will run probably 2 years from indictment to conclusion. You'll be central to the Arizona component because you're the only surviving direct witness. He turned the badge over in his hands. I've been waiting to say what I know for 12 years. 2 more years is fine. Catherine was quiet for a moment. The mountain wind moved through the space between them. Somewhere in the facility behind them, the sound of federal personnel managing the scene, voices, equipment, the deliberate machinery of an investigation beginning its formal process. I should have fought harder for you, Catherine said. Not making an occasion of it. Just stating a fact she'd apparently been holding for some time. After Arizona, when the file went to review, I had standing to flag the inconsistencies in the finding. And I filed a note, and I let it be noted, and I didn't push. She looked out at the mountains. I told myself the system would work it out. Which is the thing people say when they don't want to pay the cost of making it work. He looked at her. She was older than the last time he'd seen her, which was obvious. time being what it was, but more than that. She looked like someone who had carried this specific thing for 12 years, and was now putting it down in the only way it could be put down, which was out loud, in front of the person it concerned. Terry Coleman's family, he said. That's what it cost. Yes. Then that's what matters now. She looked at him. He held the look, and then she nodded, once, the way Catherine Hill nodded when she had received information she intended to act on. The sun was dropping behind the western ridgeline. By the time the federal scene management wound down enough for the principals to move, Raymond Harris had been transported. Harold Reed had been transported. The facility was locked and tagged and in the custody of the relevant federal division. Darnell Cooper and Marcus Okafor were at a regional medical facility, neither critically injured, both already providing formal statements. Vanessa came to find Anthony by the concrete barrier. She'd changed her jacket. One of the federal team had produced something more practical than the white business suit, which had not survived the day with any of the qualities it had arrived with. She still carried herself the same way, upright, precise, but there was something different about the precision now, something less like armor, and more like bone, structural rather than defensive. Catherine offered you a consulting position, she said. She mentioned it. Are you going to take it? He looked at the mountains, at the ridgeline where the last light was catching the upper rocks and making them briefly, privately gold before the shadow came up. Part-time, the training program for insider threat recognition. I know what that failure looks like from the inside, what it feels like, before anyone can see it from the outside. That's useful, if it's applicable. It's applicable. Vanessa sat down on the barrier, which was something he noticed that she sat, rather than standing in the way she'd been standing for most of the day, which had been the standing of a person who was upright, because being upright was a choice she was actively making, rather than a default. Sitting meant she had released something. I'm going to need a director of executive protection. Someone who builds a department from the ground up, who designs the protocols, selects the team, and has the authority to flag concerns at the executive level without going through anyone else first. He looked at her. I'm not offering it because you protected me today, she said. I want to be clear about that, because that framing makes it sound like gratitude, and gratitude is not the basis for a sound professional decision. She held his look, steady. I'm offering it because every person whose job it was to see danger coming today failed, and you, who nobody thought to ask, who nobody thought to listen to you, saw it at 4:31 in the morning. And you were right about every single thing, and you kept being right, while everyone who was paid to be right was being otherwise. She paused. That's not luck. That's not a particularly good day. That's what you are. He was quiet for a moment. The last light on the ridgeline held and then released. One condition, he said. Tell me, no one on my team gets called just a driver. Not by anyone. Not in any context. He said it simply, without emphasis, because it didn't need emphasis. It was just true, and it needed to be said. The people closest to the principal are the people who see what's coming first. If they're invisible, everyone is blind. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. Something in her face, a shift in the specific gravity behind her eyes, like a plate moving under terrain. I told you to keep the line, she said. 6 hours ago. In the car. You did. I watched you check that vehicle while Harold mocked you in front of his team. And I assumed she stopped, started again. I assumed you were a contract driver who was nervous and showing it in the way he was checking things. I was nervous, Anthony said. The difference is what I was nervous about. She held that. Let it sit. Then, the condition is accepted. And I mean it in the other direction too. I'm going to mean it institutionally, not just as a policy statement. Every contract employee at Carter Dynamics is going to hear it from me directly in the next 90 days, and I am going to mean it. He nodded. Then yes. 3 months. 3 months is how long it took for Raymond Harris, Harold Reed, and Lorraine Mitchell to move from arrest to formal indictment. Federal cases involving strategic infrastructure, sabotage, did not move quickly through the machinery of the Department of Justice, and the Arizona component added a layer of historical complexity that required coordination between multiple jurisdictions and the reopened file from the Secret Service Inspector General's office. But they moved. Steadily and without the possibility of being unsealed again. They moved. Raymond Harris faced charges on 7 counts: kidnapping, corporate espionage, sabotage of federally designated strategic infrastructure, conspiracy, and 3 counts related specifically to the Arizona operation, including conspiracy in the death of a federal officer. His legal team was expensive and skilled and managed to produce a bail arrangement that allowed him to reside at his home in Colorado Springs, pending trial, with monitoring conditions that his team described as appropriate and the federal prosecutor described as a starting point. Harold Reed did not make bail. The treason charge, specific, documented, supported by Darnell Cooper's recording and Harold's own admission in the hydroelectric plant, carried a weight that no bail arrangement could reasonably offset. He sat in federal holding in Denver and, after the first 2 weeks of silence, began speaking to federal investigators through his attorney in the specific, careful way of a man attempting to negotiate value for cooperation. The investigators listened. They did not offer anything in return, which suggested they already had what they needed. Lorraine Mitchell entered a not guilty plea and retained the most prominent white-collar defense firm in Denver. She was precise about it. She was precise about everything, which was either a character trait or a professional deformation from 30 years in corporate boardrooms, and at this point, the distinction didn't matter. She sat in the defendant's table at her arraignment with the composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only remaining resource worth conserving. The Carter Protocol 7 recording was central to her case. The duress flag was unambiguous. Her own voice was on the recording. Her own admission: "I stood beside opportunity. And at that time, the opportunity was you had been transmitted in real time to federal regulatory authorities and stored on servers that no one had access to, except the people who were supposed to have access to it." Her attorney described the recording as context-dependent. The federal prosecutor described it as a confession. The distinction would be resolved by a jury, and that resolution was approximately 22 months away. Anthony visited the Secret Service Memorial Wall in Washington on a Tuesday in November. He drove up the night before, stayed at a hotel near DuPont Circle, and arrived at the memorial when it opened. The morning was cold in the specific, clean way that Washington gets cold in November, not the wet cold of the mountains, but the dry, direct cold of a city built on a river flood plain, where the wind comes off the water without obstruction. Terry Coleman's name was there. It had been there since the year after Arizona, added when the case was formally closed and the death officially classified in the way that official classifications work: a finding, a file, a name on stone. The stone didn't know what the finding had said. The stone just held the name. Anthony stood there for a while. He thought about Terry in the way he sometimes permitted himself to think about Terry, not the highway, not the last conversation, not the weight of him in Anthony's arms. The earlier version, the version from the years when they were both in the work together, and the work was something they believed in, which was a belief that turned out to be correct, even when the institution that housed the work turned out to be fallible. The belief had been sound. The institution had failed. Those were 2 separate things, and Anthony had spent 12 years conflating them in a way that hadn't served him. He placed his badge beside Terry's name for a moment, just rested it there. Then he picked it up and put it in his pocket, because Catherine had been right about that it belonged with him, not on a wall. Terry Coleman's daughter, whose name was Simone and who was 24 years old and worked as a nurse in Phoenix, had received a call from Catherine Hill 3 days after the Redstone Ridge operation. Not a form letter, a call. Catherine had relayed the substance of what the reopened investigation had found, and Anthony had sent a separate letter, handwritten, 2 pages, the kind of writing that takes longer than it took, crunged, describing what her father had said, and what her father had done, and what her father had been in the years when Anthony had known him. Simone Coleman had written back, A single paragraph, brief and precise, with the quality of someone who had been carrying a version of the truth for 24 years and had just received the actual one. She said that she had always believed her father had done something brave. She said she was glad to know she had been right. Anthony had read that letter several times. The first day he came in as Director of Executive Protection was a Monday in December, 3 weeks after the formal announcement went out to Carter Dynamics staff, and the department structure was approved by the board, a board that was, following Lorraine Mitchell's indictment and the resignation of its indictment and the resignation of 2 additional members who had been implicated in the broader inquiry, operating with a composition that was notably different from the one that had been pressuring Vanessa about the Aegis contract 6 months ago. He drove himself to the tower in the Accord, parked in the executive garage for the first time without a convoy to prepare for, took the elevator to the 38th floor, where the Executive Protection Department's new office suite occupied space that had previously been used for storage, and, before that, for an executive assistant pool that had been consolidated elsewhere during a restructuring 8 years ago. The office was clean, functional, 4 workstations, a briefing room, a secure communications console that Anthony had specified and the facilities team had installed with gratifying competence, a window looking south toward the mountains, which on clear days showed the line of peaks that included, if you knew where to look, the ridgeline above Redstone Pass. He put his badge on the desk, sat down in the chair, looked at the window for approximately 90 seconds. Then he went down to the garage and checked the fleet. He was on the 3rd vehicle, rear left wheel well, working through the standard sequence when Vanessa Carter came through the garage entrance. She was early, earlier than her schedule indicated, which he'd already reviewed. This was something he'd noted over the past 3 months. She arrived earlier than her schedule on days when she had something she wanted to discuss before the formal structure of the day began. It was a pattern. He filed it. She stopped when she saw him on the floor. The Director of Executive Protection, she said, does not need to check the fleet personally. He kept working. No title I've heard of has ever noticed a slow leak in a left rear before it failed on a mountain highway. He could hear the particular quality of silence that was her considering whether to push back on this and concluding that the argument was structurally sound. Fair point, she said, after a moment. Structurally and in every other way. He finished the check and stood up, looked at her across the length of the vehicle. She looked back. 3 months had changed some things about the way they occupied the same space. Some of the formality had shifted, not into informality, but into a kind of directness that was its own professional language, the language of 2 people who had been in a tunnel together and who knew things about each other that conference rooms don't produce. She held out the keys to the new vehicle, the department's primary executive transport, a different car than the one that had gone into the canyon, same classification, different vehicle, the same understated armoring, and the same satellite communication system. This one with a secondary backup channel that Anthony had personally verified was functional before the car left the dealer. He looked at the keys for a moment. Then he reached out not for the keys, but for the driver's door, which he opened. She looked at the open door. Looked at him. I drove you through the worst night of your professional life, he said. Today you drive me somewhere I'm supposed to be. That seems like the right direction. Something moved through her face, not quite a smile, but the thing that exists in the structure before a smile arrives, which is warmer than the smile itself and less performed. She got in, adjusted the mirror, put her hands on the wheel with the particular decision of someone doing something they've chosen rather than something they've been told to. He got in on the passenger side, closed the door. The garage was quiet around them, the building not yet fully awake, the early hour belonging to the people who arrived before the day began, who checked the things that needed checking before anyone was watching. She pulled out of the space, navigated toward the garage exit with the care of someone driving an unfamiliar vehicle, which was the appropriate care. My father taught me to drive in an empty parking lot, she said. Not to him, particularly, more to the middle distance. He said the first thing you learn isn't how to go, it's how to stop. And then, only after you know how to stop, then he'd let me go. She guided the car toward the exit ramp. I think I spent a lot of years going without knowing how to stop. I think I learned that in a canyon. He looked out the passenger window at the garage wall, at the exit ahead, at the pale December light waiting at the top of the ramp, on the dashboard, where the vehicle identification materials were stored in the small compartment above the navigation screen. He'd placed 2 items that morning, before she arrived: his Secret Service badge and his new Carter Dynamics identification card, Director of Executive Protection. His name on both of them, the same name, Anthony Wilson. Not a correction, not a restoration, just the name of a man who had driven through one kind of mourning and arrived in another, who had spent 12 years being invisible, not because he was small, but because no one had remembered to look, and who had discovered, in a flooding turbine room, in an old mining tunnel, on a mountain road, that someone had tried to make into the last road he'd ever drive, that the thing they couldn't take from him when they took everything else was the thing that had mattered all along. He knew what to look for. He knew how to read 3 crows lifting from a ridgeline, how to read the dry dirt at the base of a signpost, how to read the scratch on a communication housing before anyone else had arrived at the garage. He knew how to read the shape of danger before it announced itself. And he had always known, and the 12 years of not being asked about it had not changed what it was. The car reached the top of the ramp. The December light came in through the windshield. The city spread ahead of them, the mountains visible to the west under a sky that was high and clear and entirely indifferent to what had happened under it 6 months ago, which was appropriate. The sky had its work, and Anthony Wilson had his, and both of them were doing it. Vanessa drove south on the avenue that curved toward the Civic Center, taking it at the easy pace of someone with nowhere urgent to be, and Anthony sat in the passenger seat of an armored vehicle in the company of a woman who had once told him to keep the line and had spent the intervening 6 months doing something considerably more difficult than that. She had changed the lines entirely. He watched the city go by. The badge in the dashboard compartment caught the winter light at a particular angle and held it briefly, the way metal holds light fully briefly, and then releases it without comment, without ceremony, just because that's what it does. The car moved on. The morning was ordinary, which was the best thing a morning could be, and Anthony Wilson, who had once stood inches from a president, who had spent 12 years in the space between what was true and what was documented, who had driven through fire and flood and mountain dark and arrived, improbably, exactly here, looked out at the city ahead of him and felt, for the first time, in longer than he could honestly calculate, that he was not running from something. He was simply going somewhere, and the going this time was entirely his own.